My name is Sheree Haggan, and I work with Google, and I work in staffing. So I wish I could say, come see me if you need a job, but I don't work in that side of staffing, but more than happy to review some resumes and help you out afterwards. Before working at Google, I worked as a multicultural program coordinator for Utah State University. And I loved that role, and I struggled with that location. But what I really learned while I was in Utah was the importance of inclusion. And that's what I'm going to talk to you guys today about is exclusion, why it's a problem, and what we can do about it. I titled my presentation, Blind and Soar No More, Seeking Ambiguity to Create a More Inclusive World. I was raised in southern Idaho. How many of you guys know where Idaho is? Yes, okay. I got an Idaho rep here. Veronica and I went to college together in Idaho. One thing that you know about Idaho is one? Potatoes. Yes, okay. Yes, we have a lot of potatoes. And not a lot of diversity, right? So there weren't a lot of people who looked like me. So I couldn't see myself reflected a lot of times when I was growing up. When I was 12 years old, my sister and I, I'll stand over here, Ms. Josh, she's recording this for the fam back home. When I was 12 years old, me and my sister were walking home from school, because you can do that and it's safe in Idaho. We were walking home from school, and a group of boys came up behind us, and they shouted, "Let's go make something of those brownies." And they continued to scream at us as we were running home, "Go back to that plantation where you came from." When I was 17 years old, I was giving a presentation, and I had my hair natural, so it was curly, and I've got some really great volume. And at the end of the presentation, I was told that my hair is unprofessional. When I was 20 years old, I was told that I couldn't bring my girlfriend to a dinner with a board of trustees from the university because they said it would make them uncomfortable. 26, yesterday, I get a phone call from my sister who tells me that she's at this conference and she went to sit with her team at the table for lunch and there were no seats. So she sat next door at a table close by, and nobody stood up and went and sat with her. So she sat alone. And then she decided, I'm just going to sit up and go inside and wallow by myself. What do all of these things have in common? And it's that common thread of exclusion, or that lack of inclusivity. We talk a lot about diversity. How many of you guys can agree that diversity is important? Raise your hands. All right, diversity is important. Inclusion is important. Raise your hands if you think inclusion is important. All right, now here's a tough one. Exclusion sucks. Raise your hand if you think exclusion sucks. Absolutely, absolutely. And we talk so much about diversity. We talk so much about inclusion. But when it comes to the topic of exclusion, we don't talk about it. Why is it that we don't talk about exclusion? What do you think? It's scary. It's painful. And what do we hear all the time? We gotta be nice, right? And we gotta be welcoming, and we gotta be positive, and we gotta leave our home problems at home. I got commended one time at work because my boss is like, I know you've got so much going on in your life and you just don't bring it to work, and I just want to commend you for that. But yet I'm supposed to bring my full self to work, right, at the same time. And so that's a problem. We need to start discussing exclusion. We need to start talking about what it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, so that we can then, in turn, create a more inclusive workplace and an inclusive world. So I'll share a story with you. I've got an 8-year-old nephew. Anyone who knows me knows I'm obsessed with my nephews, like fully obsessed. I have 2 of them. And my 8-year-old nephew is really smart for his age because he's raised by a therapist. And my sister goes to pick him up from an after-school program, and he comes running up to her with these big alligator tears. He's just like crying, and you know when you're like holding it together really good, and then you see your mom, and you're just like breakdown moment, like I was really doing good before I saw you, because that's your safe space. So my sister walks in, he runs to her, big alligator tears, he's crying, and he said he was being bullied by a couple of boys in the room. And he was having a hard time with it. He pulls her over to the corner and he says, Mama, I just don't want them to see that they made me cry. And that's this here, right? That's that shame, that's that embarrassment that you're feeling when it comes to exclusion. And I just wanted to fight them when I heard this story. I was like, ooh, point out to me, I don't care that they're 80 years old. Auntie is coming. And my sister, being the mature adult that she is, she sat down with him and she was like, no, honey, they need to see what they did to you. They need to see the result of their actions. And that's so important and translates so well into our everyday lives, because how many times as women, as people of color, as people of the LGBT community, do we feel excluded but yet we go in the corner and we just wallow by ourselves. And we feel that shame and we feel that embarrassment by ourselves. And then what that creates is resentment, and that creates bitterness, and that creates shame, and that affects our self-esteem. And it's not helpful for anybody. And so she took him, tears and all, over to these older boys and showed them and said, look what happened. Look what you did. And you know what their response was? We're just messing around. We didn't know that it was hurting him at all. And that's the thing about exclusion is it oftentimes doesn't happen on purpose. We don't go into situations and say, oh, I just really want to exclude people today, or I just want to create my own clique, and I want everyone to just feel like they suck. We don't do that. It happens on accident. And the reason why that happens, let me address this real quick. So if we all can agree we don't want to be excluded, we agree inclusion is awesome and we love it, then why is exclusion still happening? And the reason why is because we have this thing called privilege. And on the opposite side of that coin, we have a thing called oppression. We oftentimes talk about oppression. We know what that looks like. That looks like Holocaust. That looks like slavery. That looks like not having a seat at the table. So we can address that. The other side of oppression is privilege. And so those are people who benefit as a result of us being oppressed. They benefit as a result of us being discriminated against. Annie DeFranco has a song. Any Annie DeFranco fans? Yes, big one? Okay. And she says, privilege is the headache you don't know you don't have. And so we'll translate that for you. Privilege is the headache that you don't know you don't have. Oppression is the headache, right? And so if anyone suffered with chronic pain or knows someone who suffers with chronic pain, how often do you think about that pain? All the time. That's 24/7. My little sister used to have migraines, and when she got a headache, the house was shut down. Lights off, music off, we had to leave the house. My mom would kick us out, be like, do you have a friend you can stay with? And it took over. And that's how oppression operates. And when you're excluded and you don't feel safe in your work environment, that's 24/7. That affects your work, that affects your life. It's every single fiber of your being when you're excluded. And when you're in privilege, you have no freaking clue. No idea. Van Jones says when you've got a one-up on somebody, so privilege, it creates blind spots. One down creates sore spots. So in that situation with my nephew, those boys had no idea. They had blind spots. And for my nephew, he was in pain. He was hurting as a result of that. And the hardest thing when you've got a one-up on somebody is that you're doing it unintentionally. You want to know better. You want to do better. I hope so. But it's so hard to translate down here because it takes work, it takes pain, it takes empathy to get to the point where you can understand somebody who's one down. And the opposite, when you're one down, you're dealing with PTSD, you're dealing with pain, you're dealing with shame, you're dealing with the fear of I don't want to be the stereotype. And so it's hard to help people who have no idea what you're going through. It's hard to help them get there, and it's hard to help them understand. So what the heck do we do about this? One, educate. How many people in the room have ever screwed up when it comes to inclusion? I definitely have. When it comes to the LGBT community, there are people who don't know what that acronym means. Google it. There are people who don't know. I got asked today, why are you having International Women's Day, making a big deal about that? Women are fine. Google it. Right? We've got to educate ourselves. We've got to be intentional about that. And there's everyone in this room has a blind spot to something. Everyone has a blind spot to something. And ignorance is not an excuse. First time, that's fine. And then go Google it and figure it out, because it's not okay a second time. So we've got to educate ourselves. The next thing is we've got to validate experiences. If someone comes up to you and says, I really have a headache, Jody, you're not going to be like, no, you don't. That's weird, right? If someone has a headache, you can't validate that experience. You're not in their head. You don't know what's going on. Another excuse that we also hear in terms of invalidation is if I come up to Veronica and I say, I have a headache, and she says, are you sure you have a headache? Maybe you just think you have a headache. And that happens. That happens. When you say, I don't feel included in my workspace, or I don't feel my voice is valued. If I raise my hand, people are speaking over me. And then someone says, maybe I think you're making it up. Maybe you're just looking for a reason to feel excluded. And that happens. But if that's you, if you're in a privileged place, you've got to validate. Next thing is diversify. Diversify your mind, diversify your experience. Why is it that older generations typically are more narrow-minded? They've gotten comfortable. They've gotten so comfortable. Same job, same people, same food, same everything. And you get your mind accustomed to comfortability. So then when you experience something that's different, it's scary for you. It's hard for you to understand. It's new. It's like uncomfortable. And so you've got to continue to diversify the world around you, because the moment you stop doing new things, it becomes easier for you to exclude others. Join and leave the table. You've got to recognize when it's time for you to join the table. It's hard. It sucks. I was talking with someone today and they're like, no, like it's so hard for me to keep telling people I still don't feel included, or I'm still having a hard time, or I still feel discriminated against. We hear it all the time. People are tired. They want to tap out. But look around you. We are a force to be reckoned with. And if we all stay in this fight and we all continue to join that table, we are so much more powerful together than we are on our own. So I encourage you, find those opportunities to join the table and keep fighting. Also, know when to leave the table. If you look around you and you're not seeing diversity, sometimes you've got to give up your seat. And that's hard to do when you're in privilege. Sometimes you've got to give that seat up. All right, the last thing here is expose and share the burden. Expose that. So going back to my 8-year-old nephew, it's hard because we're dealing with stereotypes. We don't want to be seen as weak, and we don't want to be seen as sensitive, but it's important for us to continue to expose those times where we feel discriminated against and excluded, to expose for those blind spots to go away. We need to increase that vision and share that burden. So my sister at that table, how hard is it to get your food, get up, go sit at a new table, start a new conversation? That takes work. That takes a lot of work, and that's a small example. But sometimes you gotta get up, you gotta share the burden, and you gotta take part in that. So I encourage you guys, continue to be bold for change. Use this hashtag. Let me know your challenges. I'm gonna stalk this hashtag like crazy and look for some topics of inclusion and pledges for it to be more inclusive. But I challenge you to seek out ambiguity to create a more inclusive world.